It is not death that man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live at all. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. If you haven't taken a look at that, I definitely recommend it. It's a conversation with somebody who's much more comfortable with the idea of death than I think most of us are today in our millennium. And I think it's important for us to reclaim that conversation. I think if we're going to understand our journey and where we're headed, I think we begin at the end with a conversation about death and violence. We're talking today about apparent contradictions in Scripture. And we started talking last week about where I think we begin. I think we have to look through the lens of Imago Dei, the idea that we are made in the image of God. And that is the beginning. That is what the rest of that saga is aiming for. We are in the midst of a journey towards reclaiming that relationship that was intended at the beginning between eternal beings that were the imagers of a good and holy God. And when we lose sight of that and we don't live out that purpose, that's where the chasm between us and God begins, and the rest of that saga unfolds. God working to restore us, to reclaim that relationship that was lost in the Garden of Eden. So that's a bit of where we were, and I think if that is the lens at which we're viewing the rest of the text, it helps us understand where we go astray. We are the imagers of God. That is our purpose. And anytime we're not representatives, carbon copies of God's holiness and love and righteousness, we are missing the mark. There's an archery term that's used in Scripture for sin. It's like missing a bullseye. We see where the target is. We have to see where the target is to know where we're going. Then, I think we can start tackling the other apparent contradictions in Scripture. And I think a great place to start is with death. Very difficult thing to talk about. The closest I've come to experiencing a really painful death was early in my 20s. My wife and I didn't realize that she was pregnant. Having 3 kids now, it was plainly obvious that the morning sickness and the nausea and all the other wonderful things that come along with pregnancy were happening. But we didn't recognize it at the time. We're just young kids, not thinking that was going to happen. She was having a lot of pain one day. We realize now that she was having a miscarriage. So she was having a really difficult time, and she came to get me, and she brought me into the bathroom and asked me to look down in the toilet, and I saw a little person there. It was a fetus, but it was a person. You could see that it was a person. And I think, I've always done a pretty good job of just avoiding the feelings and dealing with it and toughing it out. I didn't know then how. I have 3 kids now. I see the life that just like a volcano. I mean, they're just bursting with life, and it just comes from this deep well within, and it's endless, and it's beautiful to see, and it's exhausting and stressful and wonderful. And I've seen it 3 times now, and I just think life is such a gift, and they've taught me so much. And I was just reflecting on this, wanting to have this conversation about apparent contradictions in Scripture and how a good God could allow things like death or violence to exist. I like all the memories of that moment came flooding back, and I was talking to my wife about it. And I was like, I never knew what that meant. Like, I never knew what a loss that was. And yeah, I've just been, it just breaks my heart. And, but I have hope. I have hope that, that little boy or girl, whoever he or she was going to become, is being cared for by somebody far greater at parenting than I am. And I do believe wholeheartedly that someday I'll get to meet my son or daughter, whoever that was going to be the first of the Richardson clan. And that's comforting. I don't blame God for death in the macro sense of things. God is not shy about the fact that he is the God of calamity. What we find in the pages of Scripture, when we really look at it, is really interesting. We seem to think, as everybody did even around Galileo's time, that we are the center of the universe and that everything kind of revolves around us. But what Scripture shows us is we've got it backwards. God is not reacting to people and nations. God's plan is, he's the actor. He is the actor. And we move out of a response to his will, his desires, his influence. Sometimes we're on his side and being used for good when we so choose. And other times he raises armies up like the Babylonians. He said through his prophet, right now, even now, I'm raising up an army for myself. And he wasn't talking about Israel. He was talking about the Babylonians, who he was going to have come through and teach the Israelites a lesson by crushing them and leaving nothing but a remnant. And the image that was used at the time was like beating an olive tree. They would beat the olive tree, shake it, the olives would fall. But there was always a few left up at the top, a few that you couldn't get to, and you just leave them there. That remnant, that's how Israel was described at the time when God was speaking about what he was going to do. There'd be a remnant, like the olives left at the top of a tree. God is not shy about the fact that he's a God of calamity. How can that be? How can he be a good God? How can we believe that he's a good God and that be so? I think it all comes down to the fact, that's two things really. One, if he is truly infinitely holy, as he claims to be, and as it appears, not at first glance, but when you really look at what's going on, the fullness of this story, if he's infinitely holy, would he be holy if he allowed sin to perpetuate, to give birth to more sin, to generational sin, to cultural sin, to societal sin in perpetuity? I think we can see around us when a friend that we care for starts mixing in with less than copacetic folks, what do we do? It's that adage, water seeks to find its own level. We become the lowest common denominator of our community. If we find ourselves among people that aren't savory, we become unsavory. If we surround ourselves with greatness, with people who are reaching for something higher, who have a purpose beyond themselves, we too are going to start to aspire to those things. God knows this, and this is exponential. Just like laughter and love is contagious, so is evil. How much more? I had a business partner once who, they wanted sex in exchange for my professional producerial services? And I said, no. And they said, well, I'm going to spread a lie in the media that you raped me and assaulted me. And by the time you even start to begin to defend yourself, that lie will have traveled all the way around the world and you'll forever be a rapist or like a Weinstein or whatever. And I was like, okay. It was a sobering moment for me when I realized the power and infectious nature of sin. Evil spreads pretty fast. I think God knows this. So maybe God's attitude towards sin and our breaking of covenants with him is an act of mercy, is an act of love, is an act of holiness. We can't look at situations through our eyes to understand God. I saw a quote the other day, how can we possibly begin to understand the infinite universe through the synapses of a primate? There's only so much that we can comprehend as far as who God is and how big and infinite and holy and good he is when we see things through our side. The other side of this is that we have to recognize that there's a covenant relationship between God and man. And the Abrahamic covenant is really the foundation of understanding all of Scripture. I'll give it to you. It's let me come over here to my notes. I think it's important that we read what this is. Okay. Here's the Abrahamic covenant. If we understand this and we look at the rest of the story through this lens, I think we can really understand things like the promised land and God's attitude towards the Israelites and towards us. And we can understand the messianic prophecies and how God would eventually work to bless the whole world. But it says this in Genesis 12. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We know now that the fulfillment of this promise would eventually come through the person of Jesus, through that Davidic line. But if we understand that we're in a covenant relationship with God, and that we can choose to be enemies of that, or on God's side, then the rest of his actions seem to make sense. And I'll give you one final example of what that means, what I mean by that. Let's look to Molech. Yahweh, the God of Israel, has worked tirelessly to prove that he is the one and only true God. He did it with the Egyptians, a polytheistic culture who had a God for everything. And every plague that he sent while freeing the Hebrews, redeeming them, was really a giant middle finger to their gods, to their little gods that couldn't compete with him. He blotted out the sun. He sent the frogs, the locusts. It was a message to their gods that they weren't real or powerful enough to stop him. Then you get things like Molech and Baal, where child sacrifices are taking place. God hated child sacrifices. In Jeremiah 7:31, we get this. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which are in the valley of Ben Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters with fire, which I did not ordain, neither did it enter my mind. Jeremiah 19:5, they have built the high places of Baal to burn their children in the fire as offerings to Baal, something I did not command or mention, nor did it enter my mind. So what did God tell the Israelites to do? To wipe these people off the map. Men, women, children, animals. It was a systematic dismantling of Molech, this god. All the parts required for that act of worship, for that church. He was eliminating the men that would take the children to the altar of Molech. He was dismantling the women who were misusing that gift of life. The greatest gift we as human beings have is the gift of life that comes through women's wombs. He was dismantling their ability to reproduce the source of offerings to Molech. He was taking away the actual sacrifices that would be used to Molech. Besides, in archaeological discoveries, we found that next to urns or vases full of bones and fragments of children that were used in sacrifices were also animals. He was also taking away the animals that were used in worship to Molech. This cancerous disease of evil that had taken his creation away from him, he was like with a scalpel cutting it out and putting a stop to the spread of that. He was also completely undermining this God that was nothing to him, but had captured the minds and hearts of these people. He was cutting that out of society and making room for him to come into that land, into that place, and create a world where that kind of sacrifice didn't happen. I think we have to understand that God's perspective on death is nothing like ours. God raises bones from the dead. All throughout Scripture, Jesus talks about it. Jesus shows us. He raises Lazarus from the tomb. Lazarus, get up. After 4 days of being dead, he raised himself, resurrected, and then appeared to the disciples. He holds the keys to death in his hands. Death is nothing to him. So for him to reclaim these people could be an act of mercy. We forget that there is a real kingdom of heaven, a real city of God. Mount Zion, where heaven exists and the throne of God lives, is real. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not a real place. And some places here choose to go to war with that city, which is a mistake. But by God scraping away these people, I think it's an act of mercy. And who's to say that they're not with him now within the walls of a real city where real sacrifices can be made to the real God? What an act of mercy that would be if we find out that once that act of violence was done, they're under the wing of God the Father in heaven, freed from this place and those eternally damning acts of worship. He saved them from that. He made room for himself. The goal of God, I think, is this with human beings: to become self-actualized through our existence. He desires, because he enjoys life so much, to come to life through your eyes, to hear the world through your ears, to experience loving others through you, to enjoy this journey with you. The scripture says, he says, I delight in every aspect of your lives. He wants to come to life. And when we stop living in a way that allows him to delight in our life, oh, how painful for him. He made us to do so many wonderful, loving, good things, to bring life out of everything we touch. But we objectify women as men. We exploit each other. We put each other down for our own misguided ideas. We fight. We go to war with each other. The real war stopped being about making room for himself and these people because we proved time and time again that we could not uphold a covenant with God. We aren't righteous enough or good enough. So he decided, I'm gonna go about restoring humanity another way. Not through temples and nations, but through individual hearts. The new covenant. Christ came to fulfill the new covenant. The new covenant. On the night before his death, he took the bread and the wine, and he said, "This is my body and blood shed for you." This is the new covenant. When we consume Christ, we take on the new covenant, and he comes to live with us, finally fulfilling that goal that he's desired the entire time, which is to experience life through our eyes. So I think death through God's eyes is an act of mercy. It's an act of atonement, an act of justice, a consequence we deserve. It's the final stop as far as distancing ourselves from him because of our sin. It's a full stop. And the beginning of restoration can take place once we die. But resurrecting people from death of a human body is nothing to him. So, although it seems to contradict the idea of a good and loving God, I think the kind of death and violence we see in Scripture proves just how loving, how good, and how holy he is.